everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. George Neal gets lost. Hello there. You know, hardly a year goes by, but what a story turns up of someone who went hunting or fishing or hiking in our woods and got themselves lost. It's not hard to do, and if you don't know the woodsman tricks, the tricks that the oldest timber cruisers knew and practiced, and the first settlers learned almost from the cradle, you can very well be lost for a long time in our thick timber. The one thing that the timber looks most like is more timber, and when a tenderfoot, or for that matter of fact, a pretty well calloused veteran of the backwoods, has looked at hills and hills and more hills covered with trees, trees and more trees, well, you can't blame them a bit if they begin to look a bit alike. And that's what happened to them. Then the next thing, if they don't have a compass, they start hiking in circles. Oh, they don't realize it, and I don't know that there is a rule out there in the West as to which way the circle goes from right to left or left to right. But they circle all right and eventually come right back to the point where they started. It may be that people circle one way north of the equator and the other way south of the equator, just like the water runs down the drain or the drain on the opposite side of a hot street. Anyhow, it has been established that this is the customary thing to do when you're lost. Go in circles. Old-timers and people familiar with the woods don't seem to have much trouble with it. They know that if they pick a distant landmark and walk towards it, then pick another and keep going towards that, they can beat the vicious circle. But it takes that savvy that comes from a long acquaintance with the woods to do it without hesitation. Then there's the old rule about getting down into a stream and walking down the stream until you come to a larger stream, and walking down that to a river, and following that to the mouth that may open up to the ocean, or somewhere along the river, or the harbor, or along the edge of the ocean. There's bound to be a trace of civilization, and that's where you cease to be lost. You're eventually found. Now, our story tonight has to do with an Easterner who came out here and learned about the West. Learned very quickly that he couldn't go gallivanting around the woods at will, disregarding trails and landmarks. And it came near to being his undoing. It was back in the mid-1920s that George Neal came out to the harbor from Wisconsin. He was not a young man. He had seen his best days, and records have it that he was 75 when he got off the train in Hoquiam. He was what you'd classify as a wandering worker, not a bum or a hobo, but a transient worker, and he set out to find a job in Hoquiam. Now, they were not thick right at the time, and after a few weeks he decided to go down along the coast. The state was working on the Olympic Peninsula Road, building the ocean side of the Olympic Loop. Someone told him that if he would go up that way, he'd strike a job. And there were plenty of them in the peninsula back in those days that were breaking a trail through that wild, unmarked country. Neal left civilization near the mouth of the Quinault River. He had hiked up the beach to Taholah, and the Native Americans put him across the river, and at Raft River, they gave him a lift to the other bank. Then he had a light pack with a few things in it, and money enough to buy a few things to keep him from going hungry. And he figured that he could camp out for several weeks if he had to. It was summer, mid-August to be exact, and Neil took in lungs full of good salt air as he hiked the coast, stopping at times to spend the night on a beach and cook by driftwood fire. It was a great life, he thought, a far cry from Wisconsin. Now, he had been told that if he went up the coast about so far and then struck inland at a clear spot, he would come to the road that they were building. And all along the coast, as he hiked, he watched for trail leadings in from the beach. And finally, above Raft River, he found one. It was a clearly defined trail that showed much travel, and he was sure that this was the one he was looking for. Someone familiar with the country would probably have identified it as Elk Trail. But not George Neil, and he turned off from the beach and started inland. Well, you know how an elk trail runs. It's well marked near the water hole, but as you back away from it, the trail leads off, each one confusing to the other, then disappearing altogether. And after trying to follow the little trail that diverged, he finally sat down to rest and get his bearings. But the bearings didn't get him. What he thought was the direction of the beach turned out to be another direction, and after walking for hours, he found he was lost. He turned one way and then another, but neither trails nor signs of civilizations could be seen. Finally, he camped for the night and made up his mind to rest until daylight, then start out again. He did. He rested all night, sleeping by the fire on dry limbs, and started out hungry at daylight to find the beach. He walked all day and spent another night in the woods, then walked another day and camped a night. His food was running low. He found plenty of streams for water and a few berries that supplemented his food, but after 5 days in the woods, he was weak and his food was gone. But still, for 4 more days he wandered aimlessly, not knowing where he was or where he could go. Lost. Alone in the wilderness as he had never seen before. At the end of 9 days, his clothes were tattered from the tough brush tearing at it. He had thrown away his pack sack, which had grown too heavy to carry. He had discarded his one blanket. When night came, he sank into the ground, too tired to move another step, and he just lay there. With morning, he wanted to go on, but 4 days without food and fatigue of endless hours of hiking were too much for him. He couldn't stand. Moreover, his will was badly shaken by the aimless wandering and utter helplessness of his plight. He lay in the trail all that day, one of those trails that came from nowhere and went nowhere. That evening, he managed to stagger to a little creek nearby and get a drink. And in the half-darkness, he stumbled and fell on a little gravel bar and lay still. And there, right at that spot, many a story of a lost man in the wilderness ends. But George Neil was playing in luck. But his best reckoning, it was 2 days that he lay there unable to move. Had it been any month but August, he would have died from exposure. But it was August, and George Neil was hardly a specimen of human being, even at 75. It was that day that 4 Tahola Indians hunting near Raft River decided to cut inland and try their luck up at a little draw. They followed the river in, then branched at a small stream and followed it to the uplands. They had worked their way back into the wilderness part of Raft River country, 5 or 6 miles they estimated, when the leader of their party shouted. He pointed up the stream through the thick growth of devil's club and alder trees. "A body!" he said, and thought it was George Neil. The 4 Indians found him dead, more dead than alive, and making a carrying seat for him, they took him back down the stream bed to Raft River, a distance of several miles. On the banks of the river, they cooked him a meal of fish and gave him some of their coffee. They built a fire for him and rolled him in one of their blankets. That night, they left one of their party in charge of him, to mind the fire and take care of the old man's requirements. And the other three returned down the river to report their discovery and obtained assistance for bringing him out. It was Saturday night when the Native Americans came to the mouth of the Raft River and found the party of Grays Harbor Olympians camping at the mouth of the river after Saturday's hike up the coast. They told the story, and early the next morning a group of Olympians headed upstream on an errand of mercy. They found George Neal too weak to walk, so tired that his story hardly made sense, but willing to travel and do anything to get out of the clutches of the Washington wilderness. They made him a litter for him with the relays of carriers, lugged him down by raft to river camp and to civilization again, and when they left him, he was at the Queets Cannery. The Olympian had given him several small meals. The cannery operator agreed to help him, and George Neal, who had weighed 140 pounds when he went into the wilderness, came out weighing less than 100. But so glad to get out that he never ceased to thank the Olympians who had brought him back to the civilization again. The story of George Neal was reenacted countless of times by people who have strayed off the beaten paths on the backwoods country of our Olympic Peninsula. It is almost always a story of someone who did not know the woods for what it can be, and once sheltering and confusing. A great mantle of protection against the sun and the elements, yet at the same time a den where the elements can break a man's heart with the teasing and sap his strength in vain and futile assault of his boundless and soul-testing obstacles. The men who have disappeared into the woods of the Northwest, most often like George Neal, were unfamiliar with it, but there have been others. There was the story of Simon Monroe, used to tell about coming in from Blackwell's camp up the Wishkah in the early days. He hiked to forks of the Wishkah, where he usually found a boat and rode to town when he came in. On this occasion, he decided to take a shortcut that he had never taken and only heard of. He had not asked for details, but because it was late and he wanted to save a few minutes walking and get out of the timber the quickest way, he turned off the path at a point he had heard described as the way to go. There was unmistakable signs of a trail, but in the darkness that comes so quickly in the thick timber, he lost traces of the trail. Night came, inky and black. He sat down where he was and built a fire, and beside the fire he spent the night. In the morning he took his bearings, made some mental notes by dead reckoning, and took off. At noon he came over a ridge into Blackwell's camp, the place he had started from nearly 24 hours before, and anyone who knew Sim Monroe knew that he was about as good a lumberjack and woods worker as there was in early Grays Harbor. But he told the story of himself with many a self-conscious chuckle, like a man who had started for the post office and ended up at the port dock, having lost his way. So I suppose there could be no rule for it. The difference was that the woodsman got out. The tenderfoot usually is gone beyond hope, unless, as happened to George Neal, a miracle sent some Quileute men up the draw for hunting of the elk that would have stopped and saved his life. George Neal is long gone, and his story is only one of countless dozens that read most identically. That is typical of our big wood country, where a man who has not graduated in the schools of woodmanship is never quite as mature in the wilds of Washington's woods. And as such, it's a story that finds its place tonight in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.